this video will hopefully answer a few questions that are lingering in people's minds. What we'll do is we'll give you a bit of a history as to where we've been, go on to the information that everyone's been wanting to find out, and end up with a summary of where we're going to from here. So firstly, the company that was hired to do this inquiry was Mercer. They're an independent consulting organisation. Their report has been released and is available on the UV website, and the report is independent. So basically what that means is both parties were able to provide information and data to Mercer, and it was up to Mercer to interpret and report on that data. There's been no influence from either the government, QAS or the United Voice. The Mercer report includes information and changes across the Queensland Ambulance Service and compares remuneration with interstate job roles. I'll now hand over to Jason from United Voice, who can explain a few differences between the Mercer process that we're going through in the EB process and the QIRC process.
The Mercer inquiry is broader and more comprehensive than the two previous industrial tribunal arbitrations. Mercer has the capacity to collate and prepare extensive independent information, meet and talk with hundreds of employees, and have site inspections. In Queensland, Mercer weren't restricted to a case where there was only a small amount of witnesses. They were talking to over 400 people on the ground in Queensland, and over 2,200 people made submissions to the survey. The inquiry featured cooperative objectives in gathering true and correct information, not an adversarial process designed to undermine parties' case. So when you go to an arbitration court, there has to be two sides, and each side is there to undermine the argument or the position of the other. In this case, we had both sides that are in agreement with the information, and that enabled Mercer to have open access to not only QS information, but also other states' information regarding their ambulance services. This wasn't an argument, it was a cooperative agreement. The main reason Queensland remuneration has slipped in comparison to other states is because of two lengthy non-consensual forced arbitrations.
So the Mercer report deals with changes to the QAS service across the board within the past 10 years and changes such as the evolution of job roles. So we had to choose a starting point to look at where the changes have gone about, and we determined that in the last 10 years QAS has undergone some significant changes with the introduction of new roles such as the HARU, the LARU, the STRU and other specialty services as well. The report deals with changes to the nature of work performed and wage comparisons with work performed of a comparable nature across the country. I'll let Jason explain that a bit further now.
Why this is very important is because in Queensland legislation, when you take any of these sort of cases to arbitration, you're allowed to talk about the job role within Queensland, your job role and how it's changed. But what is not allowed under Queensland legislation is what's known as wage comparative justice or wage comparative analysis, which means that you cannot take the wage levels of other states and admit them into this hearing. So basically it does not matter what everyone else in other states is earning, it is not admissible in a case in Queensland, therefore it doesn't matter. Examples of changes to staff roles was something that Mercer highlighted in the report. So they calculated across some of the main roles in QAS and gave us the evidence of whether there was a low, moderate or a high change overall to that role. So for EMDs, even though their workload is high and they've got some new equipment, there was overall a low change to their role. Same with patient transport officers. There was a low overall change to the actual role they do over that time. ACPs had a high change overall because there has been significantly more or a larger amount of changes for the ACP role. CCPs had a moderate change overall in that time period. There was a staff survey that was sent out and there was over 2,200 responses. This is a fantastic result because that's over 60% of Queensland Ambulance Service staff. And there was quite significant input from people across all areas of QAS, such as ACP, comms, EMD, patient transport.
So as part of that survey, the general comments and general theme was that procedural and administrative requirements have increased along with the workload increasing. In addition to qualifications, experience is an important part of the ability to perform the role. As part of the survey, EMDs, OCSs were reported that they had an increasing requirement to multitask, that the PTOs were transporting more patients with chronic illnesses and comorbidities, and paramedics had a higher change in clinical scope of practice, accountability and decision making. CSOs, OICs, SOSs, OSs and M-Scale were fairly similar in that they all had an increasing expectation on reporting, administrative duties, as well as the number of staff that they're managing. The most common theme in the free text, which was at the end of the survey, where people could write, personal opinions and stuff like that. The most common theme was that pay should be based upon years of service. Pay should be increased for increased skills. Pay for paramedics should be in line with nurses. Pay should align with interstate services. Our superannuation contribution should be linked to our actual earnings. Roles, responsibilities, scope and volume of work have significantly increased. There's an inability to access our meal breaks and there's a lack of work-life balance. Job classification comparisons. The report includes information about ambulance job classifications compared with other states. Benchmark classifications and others have been compared with similar occupations interstate, and some classifications compare more closely than others. So what this is summarising is the fact that they were able to benchmark roles in some areas, such as ACPs, more easily than they were roles such as OSs and SOSs. And this goes on to say that same thing, where ACPs were able to be aligned closely between states. However, when it came to supervisory roles, it was hard. There was not much alignment at all. Now, those differences can be caused by the fact that their qualifications to acquire that role interstate may be very different. The nature of the work that they do can be very different. And the summary in the report goes on to explain how and why they're different and why they weren't able to be aligned. In saying that, Mercer were able to compare enough roles in order to generate a comprehensive remuneration report, and Mercer also compared QAS classification specifically with Queensland job roles such as nursing and firefighting. For example, what they were able to compare was EMDs compared to QFES comms, and critical care paramedics were able to be compared with qualified nurses. Mercer concluded the work performed by a CCP is at a higher level than a Grade 5 Year 7 nurse based upon judgment, accountability and expertise. The report also compares increments and pay point progression, such as how many increments, how much increase is applied at each increment, and how different services progress through classifications and pay points. We will touch on this a little bit later when we get into the data of our pays. The report also included a comparison of conditions, entitlements, hours of work, leave, superannuation, etc., and they found that there was no significant shortfall in those entitlements between state, and in fact we actually compared well when it came to our penalties. This point basically highlights that the issue with our pay is solely around our base rate and our hourly rate, as opposed to entitlements and penalties that we do get. Something that does come up a lot is our meal overtime, and it's important to note that in the report that they did take this into consideration, and when they did an analysis, meal overtime wasn't actually necessarily utilised. The significant finding is that Queensland is the lowest paid service on most job classifications. The maximum pay rate achievable by a Queensland ACP is approximately 13% below the national average. ACP starting rate is about 9% below national average, and graduates are only about 1% below the market. A comparable nurse within Queensland Health is paid about $270 a week more. So as you can see from this table here, Queensland is down the bottom, our national average is here, and the ACT, Victoria, WA, Northern Territory are all well above the national average, and that's at our starting rate. At our maximum base rate achievable, Queensland's still down the bottom. The national average is here, and there's more above that national average. When we move on to a graduate paramedic, as you can see, we're not too far from the top. And this is where our pay point progression is highlights that when you first start into the service, you're up near the top. Whilst there does need to still be some improvement, it's not as significant as it is after you've been in for several years, and that our pay point progression isn't good enough to align with up the top here where we want to be achieving. When we move on to a CCP, the maximum pay point achievable is approximately 17% below the national average, and a CCP starting rate is about 14% below the national average. A comparable nurse with Queensland Health is paid about $360 a week more. Once again, the findings are very similar, with Queensland down the bottom and our counterparts in other states well up the top, with the national average here. Once we move on to the maximum rate achievable, the difference becomes more significant, again highlighting the need for the pay point progression to be improved as well. EMD and comms, the maximum pay rate achievable by an EMD is approximately 11% below the national average, and a standard qualified EMD is about 7% below the national average. QFES pays about $60 a week below QAS. So whilst QFES does pay less than QAS, it's important to note that the amount of work that they do, the qualifications required, the education and everything like that is actually less for QFES in comparison to QAS. So it provides us an argument that says somebody who does less work is getting almost the same pay as what our fellow colleagues in comms are getting paid. Again, when we look at their wage structure, their starting rate or training rate is again down the bottom of the pack, with many states above us. When we move on to their Officer 1 or a comms officer level 1, again they're down the bottom, with multiple states well above us and well below the national average. Once they reach their maximum qualification and maximum base rate achievable, they are down the bottom, with the national average well above them, and again a significant difference. PTOs, the maximum pay rate achievable by a Queensland PTO is approximately 7% below the national average. And again, patient transport officer in training is down towards the bottom, with many states above them, and the national average obviously still above them. When they move on to a qualified officer, again, they're down the bottom, with multiple states well above them. And once we move on to a fully qualified PTO and the maximum base rate achievable, they are down the bottom, with many states above them, and again well below the national average. In summary, the Mercer report shows overall changes across the service and within job roles. The job role with the highest level of change was the ACP. The report shows comparative remuneration across services. The report shows that Queensland pay rates are below other services. Comparisons are not uniform across classifications. So what that's saying is that whilst there's the evidence points that we're all the lowest paid, it indicates that the percentage change required to bring everyone up into that top quartile is different across each of those roles. United Voice Ambulance State Council representative have endorsed this report, and the State Council resolved that the report should form the basis for negotiating an improved wages and classification structure to bring Queensland up to comparative levels with interstate services. So we're not aiming to get to the average, we're aiming to get into that top quartile. State Council has also resolved a preference for a new certified agreement and agreed that the last time members were able to consider a vote on a certified agreement package was back in 2005, and that's been due to the too lengthy Forced Industrial Commission arbitrations. Given that the Mercer inquiry was a joint co-funded project between QAS and United Voice, there is joint acknowledgement of the findings and the need to address the remuneration issues shown in this report. So what that's saying is we're both on the same page as we start into this process. On that basis, United Voice proposes that we immediately commence negotiations for wage increases, a new wage and classification structure, and a certified agreement that members can vote on. State Council has endorsed a resolution to be put at workplace meetings state councillors and delegates proposed a broad resolutions to allow United Voice to rely upon the Total Mercer report. So what that's saying is that we're not wanting to just pick and choose the parts of the report we use. That's saying that we want to be able to use that whole report to go forward, saying that that's all true, that's all accurate, therefore we need to use that as the evidence and basis to begin this process. The resolution that we came to was this meeting endorsed United Voice negotiating with Queensland Ambulance Service for an improved classification structure and increased wage rates to bring our remuneration to comparable levels with other professionals performing similar work as identified within the report. Thank you very much. John Urquhart from Mitchelton, La Rue, and Delegate for United Voice.